Africa, 1975. The last colonial empire was dying, and the people of Angola reached for freedom. Fresh hunting grounds for the Cold War superpowers. As Portuguese troops pulled out of Angola, three groups jostled for power. America's fears were aroused.
When Bill Colby, the CIA director, went to brief the National Security Council in the White House the first time on this, his briefing was literally, gentlemen, this is a map of Africa, and here is Angola. Now, in Angola, we have three factions. There's the MPLA, they're the bad guys. The FNLA, they're the good guys. And there's UNITA and Jonas Savimbi we don't know too well. And that was to get the National Security Council involved in this thing.
The popular movement for the liberation of Angola, the MPLA, the largest group, was left-wing. Based in and around the capital, Luanda, its multi-ethnic membership was led by Agostinho Neto and Lucio Lara. In the 1960s, it had received training from Cuba and arms from Moscow. The National Front for the Liberation of Angola, the FNLA, operated largely in the north of the country. Its leader, Holden Roberto, a strident anti-communist, had close links with neighboring Zaire, which supplied him with outdated American arms. The National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, UNITA, led by Jonas Savimbi, was based in the south of Angola. A charismatic leader, Savimbi decided that American backing was the key to power. At Alvor in Portugal, the three rival groups got together. They agreed on arrangements for independence and elections.
The United States scotched that, absolutely. Our solution was the CIA, without approval from the National Security Council, delivered $300,000 to Holden Roberto and ordered him to send his people into northern Angola.
We
weren't worried about receiving American aid. We knew that the Soviet Union was supporting the MPLA, and we had no possibility of countering that.
Secretly channeled through Zaire, American money helped pay for Roberto's war on the MPLA.
His side was always the bloodiest, the most violent. They went down and promptly killed 15 MPLA political activists. And from that time on, it was all cast, you know, the fate of Angola was cast, it was written in blood.
The Americans were not sure that Roberto's troops could defeat the MPLA. The Central Intelligence Agency sent John Stockwell to investigate.
Roberto said he had 30,000. I had trouble counting 30. Badly armed, disorganized, kind of rabble kind of troops. And he was a cocktail party cowboy. He'd spent his whole career politicking in Kinshasa. He knew nothing of military operations or logistics or organization.
Then Stockwell went south to UNITA's headquarters. Stockwell met UNITA's leader, Jonas Savimbi.
I found a different kind of a revolutionary. He'd spent the entire time inside Angola, 20 years. He had led the guerrilla fighting himself.
Whatever the consequences, whatever the results, we will continue to fight because we don't want to be slaves of Russia in Angola, in our own country.
America was now backing two of the three independence movements. Washington ruled out intervention in Angola with American troops. Instead, it turned, secretly, to South Africa.
The United States, at the highest level, requested assistance, or rather requested South Africa to go in and assist UNITA.
We did maintain a position of disapproval of apartheid. But on the other hand, the South African government was extremely powerful.
Suid-Afrika was in 'n posisie van isolasie.
South Africa was isolated. Although it was done secretly, it was good for South Africa to be cooperating with a big force like the USA, even though it was clandestine.
There were many people in policy-making positions in the Department of State who were essentially willing to have a funny, ambiguous relationship with South Africa.
The focus was on Soviet penetration and the possibility of the Soviet Union using unstable situations in Africa to benefit itself, to take root and foment trouble.
They were afraid of the MPLA. They called us communists. The South Africans were terrified of the MPLA. They didn't have that terror of the FNLA or UNITA. They were allies. They didn't like the MPLA because the MPLA declared itself against apartheid.
In Luanda, the MPLA was staging parades. In the countryside, it was losing control.
We were alone, poorly equipped, poorly trained, poorly armed. We requested help from the Cubans to help us resist that aggression.
Keen to show leadership in the developing world, Cuba sent 400 military instructors to Luanda. Moscow hadn't been consulted.
The Soviets knew absolutely nothing about it. We took the decision because of our long-standing relations over many years with NATO and with the independence movement in Angola.
We're very unhappy. I mean, obviously, we had no desire to see Fidel Castro extend his influence in the African continent. Our government in Washington perceived Fidel Castro as a Soviet proxy.
We thought, with respect to Angola, that if the Soviet Union could intervene at such distances from areas that were far from the traditional Russian security concerns, and when Cuban forces could be introduced to distant trouble spots, and if the West could not find a counter to that then the whole international system could be destabilized.
It was a question of globalizing our struggle vis-à-vis the globalized pressures and harassment of the US. In this respect, it did not coincide with the Soviet viewpoint. We acted, but without their cooperation. Quite the opposite. There were criticisms. So?
North of Luanda, Holden Roberto's FNLA troops were heading for the capital. They wanted to seize it before Angola's Independence Day. They had high hopes of success.
We actually had a celebration party in the CI headquarters in Washington. We expected the news by the end of the day that we would have captured Luanda.
Led by Cubans, the MPLA troops halted Roberto's advance.
In the middle of the valley, about 2,000 122-millimeter rockets began landing. and we had nothing to answer with, and our forces broke and ran.
The military force of the FNLA had been blunted. America's ally was in trouble. A bigger challenge now faced the MPLA. In October 1975, South African troops had invaded Angola. From their bases in Namibia, they had joined forces with UNITA.
We advanced approximately, I think, something like 80 kilometers a day. By this time, my troops were getting good, eh? I mean, they were really getting on with it now. They were out of those vehicles and into assault formations. But shoot the hell out of these people, you see, and then they would back up and move because they didn't expect us.
The South Africans were helping UNITA, and Zaire was supporting the FNLA. So it was only fair that the MPLA asked the Cubans to come and support us in the struggle against the invasions.
Just 2 days before independence, thousands of Cuban combat troops began arriving in Luanda.
In Moscow, this was greeted without enthusiasm. It was only when the Cubans had landed that we got involved. Because the Cubans kept asking us for help. They wanted weapons, they wanted food supplies. Once we started sending things to Angola, we were soon in over our heads, even though it wasn't in our plans to go there.
Moscow began shipping hundreds of tons of arms, tanks and missiles direct to Luanda. As the MPLA began rehearsals for Independence Day, battles were still raging just miles from the capital.
In spite of that, it was important for us to proclaim independence, and we did so.
The MPLA celebrated Angola's independence in Luanda. Its enemies had failed to take the capital.
The 11th of November 1975 was the hardest day in my life. I remembered the 14 years I'd been fighting. I remembered the dead, all those who had made sacrifices.
Agostinho Neto greets the Soviet ambassador. The MPLA was recognized as Angola's government by the Soviet Union, Cuba, and most of Africa. Its fight against South African troops gave the MPLA political credibility. South of Luanda, the Cubans prepared to end the South African advance.
It was a decisive battle, because if they broke our defense, it would be very difficult then to stop them getting to Luanda. There were roads going to the north, roads going to the center, many roads, which would have made their advance very powerful and fast.
The Cubans were ready, waiting.
Angola would have been lost. Mobutu's troops were close to Luanda. The South Africans had penetrated over 1,000 kilometers. They were close to Luanda.
The Cuban and MPLA forces outgunned the South Africans.
They were shot very badly.